Hello class, and welcome to Living in Faith Together. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about spiritual development as a psychological phenomena. Now, there's a researcher by the name of James Fowler that has dedicated his life to exploring the development of faith, and he has a very interesting stages of spirituality paradigm that will go a long way to helping you to understand your own spiritual journey throughout your life. Now, Fowler, like other developmental psychologists, can trace his genesis to the insight of Immanuel Kant that the human activity of knowing the world is shaped primarily by what the individual brings to that process. But what Kant saw as innate categories, Fowler sees as developmental abilities that develop through predictable stages. So we'll take a little bit of time and explore those stages. Now, Fowler's approach to the investigation of spirituality from this structural perspective focuses on the underlying structures or operations of human thought and belief, that is, on the laws and the patterns that human ability goes through in the engagement of faith activities. Now, Fowler is informed by various developmental psychologists like Piaget and Erikson and Kohlberg, and he carries out his independent research looking at the ways of being in faith and tries to discern any recognizable or sequential stages. And so a child's faith or spirituality differs significantly from an adult's, not just in content, but also in its inner patterned structure of operations. Some things that Fowler sees are that faith and spirituality are a fundamental core of who a person is. And this fundamental predisposition really does color and shape everything that comes after it. And so it's that primary focus to discern what that basic disposition or orientation of being in the world by which the person makes and maintains and transforms their human meaning. And arising from one's structural core, spirituality is the primary orientation of the person's existence. And Fowler also views this faith development or spirituality as a fluid and active process. It's never static, but it's an activity of knowing, of construing, of interpreting experiences. It's a way of making meaning out of our lives. And so faith is an active, participatory, knowing process, and the knowing is in the activity. So spirituality is not an idea, it's a way of being. And so everyone that has a way of being has a spirituality. And so for Fowler, spirituality is an really irreducible relational phenomenon. First, the relationship is between ourselves and the everyday world and other people. And in this sense, spirituality is bipolar and is always social and interpersonal. But it is also one sense of relatedness to the ultimate conditions and depths of existence. And so each person has what Fowler calls an ultimate environment, which he or she composes and struggles to maintain. By ultimate environment, within this ultimate environment or worldview, there are centers of values to which we commit ourselves, and in return feel the promise of being valued and being sustained. And for our context, these terms are more understandable when Fowler speaks of them in theological terms, of Catholic revelation, in terms of Christianity, rather than faith in the triadic relationship among ourselves, our neighbor, and our God. Fowler makes the point that the person's relationship with any one pole in that triad colors the relationship with the other poles in that relationship. And really, Fowler claims that spirituality is a human universal. Whether people claim to be religious or not, that's not really the issue. To be in the world as a human being and to choose to continue to participate in the activities of a human being is to have a spirituality. Spirituality is differentiated into various expressions by the differences in which we perceive our ultimate environment or worldview, and the different centers of value that we have within our environment. But overall, Fowler sees that there are 6 distinct and recognizable stages that we can discern in the developing human capacity for spiritual activity. And each stage is its own structural whole. But the stages are related to each other hierarchically and sequentially. They develop in an ascending order, and each stage incorporates while adding to the previous stage. The transition from one stage to another really can be protracted and painful, and can require the relinquishment and reconstruction of the previous way of being. So in order to develop, according to Fowler's model, there really needs to be spiritual crises that take place within life in order for us to move on to the next stage, to be torn down and rebuilt up, as the prophet Jeremiah would say. A new stage emerges when a person becomes consciously aware of the limitations of the present stage, and while affirming the truth in that stage, wants to move beyond its limits. And so it's a very common thing to want to question and move beyond your current spiritual stage. Now, to start off with, it's essential that Fowler does not start with a newborn in understanding this. He really considers children to the age of 3 to be essentially a sponge of their environment. So he views this as a pre-stage of spirituality, which is an undifferentiated stage where the child is forming boundaries and differentiations between the self and the world. And so we're really going to begin our discussion with stage 1, what Fowler calls the intuitive projective faith, starting around the age of 3 or 4 and going to the age of 8. So I want you to just think back when you were about 5 or 6 years old. What was your spirituality like? According to Fowler, meaning is made and trust established intuitively and by imitation. So we look at others and we try to imitate others. Knowing is primarily by intuition, things that we catch emotionally, and faith is formed by imitation of moods and attitudes. For example, actions of the visible human faith of significant others, primarily our parents. It's affective dominant. That is, knowing and feeling are fused together. The locus of authority is in the parent and in primary adults. The child begins to discover reality beyond everyday experience, and therein encounters the limits of life, such as death, limits of knowledge and power, and so on. But trust is grounded in the parents and other primary adults. And the world is known by intuitively projecting meaning in imitation to those adults. Stage 1 is a time of unrestrained fantasy and imagination, when long-lasting images and feelings, both positive and negative, are formed. Fact and fantasy are not yet differentiated in consequence. Symbols are taken literally, and God is thought to be anthropomorphic and magical, and the Bible is viewed as magical, or whatever sacred scripture is being viewed. For example, when children that are Christian or Catholic, whatever term you wish to use there, draw a picture of God, they draw pictures of God with big eyes and ears. They anthropomorphize God because he can see and hear all. And there's an awakening of memory and self-consciousness, and the capacity to take the role of another is just beginning, but only in its rudimentary form. Then we come to stage 2. And stage 2 occurs approximately around the age of 7 or 8 and continues on to around 12 years of age. And it's an affiliative faith in which the person comes more consciously to join and belong to their immediate group or particular faith community. The person now comes with some enthusiasm to learn the stories, the lore, the language, the legends, and particularly to be part of the community and to own their membership within that community. And this can happen because there is now a greater awareness of the differentiation between the self and the collective of immediate others. The way of making meaning is now more linear and narrative rather than episodic, as it was in stage 1. One's ultimate environment is conceptualized in stories and myths which are taken literally. Life is as it appears to be. Reasoning and thought beyond intuition are now possible, but thinking is still very much concrete and sensory. Children continue to anthropomorphize God in anthropomorphic terms, and this stage there's a faith in joining faith, that is, in being part of the group, in taking on its stories and myths and doctrines. And so to hear the stories of, for example, the Bible, is to feel like you are a member of a community, irregardless of what those stories are. For example, the story of Samson. Samson, if you look at it as an adult, Samson was really a bit of a sociopath. But for a child that is around 10 years of age, the story of Samson evokes an emotion of being part of a community. Then we come to stage 3, which will normally begin to develop around the age of 12. Now, we need to kind of keep in mind that some people do not even move into stage 3, because stage 2 becomes so powerful that they really remain with a very fervent and immature spirituality. But for some, they move into this stage 3 of synthetic conventional. And oftentimes, this synthetic conventional spirituality will last long into adulthood, and for some, this becomes their permanent home. A stage 3 spirituality interprets, relates, and makes meaning out of the world according to the directions and criteria of what they say, in other words, according to popular convention. It is a conventional or conformist stage, in that it is anxious to respond faithfully to the expectations and judgments of significant others. As yet, the person is without a sufficient grasp of how his or her own identity to make autonomous judgments for an independent perspective, and so there is a subjugation to those in authority. And those in authority, particularly in an ecclesiastical setting, prefer people that listen to them and do what they say, and do not question or want to grow further and challenge the status quo. For people in stage 3, that is what they do. They follow the conventions for family and school and work and church and peers and leisure time and organizations and the like. And each of these segments of life is likely to provide a variety of different perspectives and expectations and ways of making meaning. There will inevitably be some conflict, and so there's a synthesis that is reached by subordinating to different authorities under which the person perceives to be of a highest authority. So there's an awareness that there is some conflict and some desire to question and have your own judgment, but in the end, subjecting yourself to the convention of whatever group you belong to. Then there is stage 4. And you will not be seeing this normally before the age of 18. And for most people, they will not see this until they're in their late 30s or in their 40s, if at all. The transition from stage 3 to stage 4 is particularly crucial for the continuation of your spiritual journey, however. And here the conventional synthesis of stage 3 begins to collapse because of the lack of congruence between the self, in other words, you want to be an authentic human being, and the various conventional expectations of one's different groups. The transition to stage 4 comes when we can no longer tolerate being a different person when we are with different groups, or when we realize that we cannot hand the making of our meaning over to even the highest authority. We need to keep judgment to ourselves because we are responsible for our own authentic human being. Now, the responsibility of synthesis and making meaning shifts from the conventions to the individual taking personal responsibility for various commitments, lifestyle choices, beliefs, and attitudes. And as a result, there is now a qualitatively different degree of autonomy beyond stage 3. One's way of knowing and relating to the world, one's identity and worldview are more personally chosen and self-consciously differentiated from the attitudes and expectations of others. In fact, they become acknowledged factors in one's way of interpreting, judging, and reacting to experience. Even as one achieves a more autonomous spirituality, there is at stage 4 a newfound awareness of the paradoxes and polarities of life. Life becomes more complicated and more difficult, and inevitably there will be some clashes with authority in those in your 30s and 40s as you try to wrestle away control of your life from the authorities. One's faith activity now attempts to handle these tensions and maintain equilibrium, and the individual begins to select choices, and they're held in attention no longer as their absolutes. But there's a realization that there are some paradoxes in life that we need to live with and struggle with as we try to figure them out. And that then can lead to either exhaustion, where you give up and go back to stage 3, or you can struggle through to stage 5. And in stage 5 of faith activity, and this usually comes at the midlife point with a lot of struggle and a lot of study and a lot of discipline, the paradoxes that were previously dealt with by some strategy of tension reduction are now embraced and affirmed. and the tension is incorporated into one's way of being in spirituality. In other words, it's recognized that there's a lot of gray. No longer is there black and white in the world, but shades of gray as far as spirituality and right and wrong. And recognizing that complexity is very important. In everyday language, life is no longer seen in terms of either or, but there's a willingness to live with its ambiguities. There is certainly not a return to relativism or ambivalence. There is a commitment, but it's a commitment to a new quality of autonomous commitment. You know what you believe. You are continually questioning that knowledge and continually revising that knowledge, and recognize that you will not achieve the final fullness of truth. But you're okay with that. You live in a dialogue of balance. One's own system is seen as porous and incomplete. It's seen in the midst of strong commitment to it. Particulars are valued, but only because they hold the possibility of something more universal. And here symbols are looked at and affirmed. So the rites and rituals of worship that were shunned in stage 3, are now picked up and held with a newfound value. Not as subjugation to authority, but as an individual autonomous commitment, recognizing the imperfectness of the symbol. There's a stage of interdependence that takes place within stage 5. And for most people, if they live a life of intense study and commitment and questioning and challenge and engagement in the world, maybe they will experience this conjunctive faith where things come together. But then there's stage 6, and only the rarest of the rare ever experience this. In stage 6, the self ceases to be the center reference point, and the ultimate is put there instead. That is, rules are now seen completely as simple shadows of the reality of values of justice and love and hope. And love and grace and hope become the defining characteristics of spirituality and this universalizing faith. No longer is it Catholic or Protestant or Christian and Muslim. It is all people loved under God. And at this stage, recognizing and spending and transforming themselves, they care for all others. And indeed, the particulars of life are shared and cherished, but they're held loosely. In that you take yourself seriously, but not too seriously. You live a life of service and are willing to let go of that life at the end. Recognizing that we live in God's love that is undeserved but offered to all. There is not a group, there's only the world. And in that, we have the great martyrs of the faith. Those that have lived a long and full life and have recognized that in the end, that they are not in control, but they have their own place to be an autonomous, full, authentic human being. And so to review, children begin with catching the faith from others and engaging the faith and being part of that mythic literal perspective around the age of 10, and then that they move into the synthetic conventional faith in their adolescence, where they are subjecting themselves to authority and trying to find who they are within life, and then moving to an individuative, reflective faith as you move into adulthood. And if you move away from home and take years to care for others, then you become more into that individuative, reflective faith, and eventually into that faith that engages and brings together the congruence and the conjunctive faith. And ideally, some of you may reach that universalizing spirituality that is such a wonderful journey within life. I hope that gives you something to look forward to in your own spiritual journey, and you take care. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.